Annabel, Jim McClellan, talking about Malcolm Turnbull in 1991, said this: "He's a turd, he's easy to loathe, he's a shit, he'd devour anyone for breakfast, he's on the make, he's cynical, he's offensively smug." Now, which, if any, of those propositions do you disagree with?
God, I've been dreading this. Look, in general, I think that there are attributes of Turnbull that are well summed up by McClelland in that little spray. And the very essence of this man's nature is that he divides opinion. And for every person who would agree warmly with all of McClelland's assessment of Malcolm Turnbull, you would find other people who disagree. He is a divisive person. And that is because, I think, he has a very unorthodox approach to business, politics and the law. He breaks orthodoxies, he breaks rules, and as a result, he creates enemies wherever he goes. So I think in most areas of life in which Turnbull has worked, he creates ranks of people who would say all of those things about him. And I think that, you know, in quite a few of those pursuits, there are moments where he's been all of those things. He's also charming, vivacious, and good company, a great raconteur, a very brilliant person as well. I mean, I think one of the reasons that he is one of the more interesting practitioners of politics in Australia at the moment is that he is all of those things.
This is, without any doubt, the most incisive portrait of Turnbull that's been written. And I get the feeling that despite you looking bad Malcolm in the face, you still rather like Malcolm.
I like a lot of politicians, particularly the awful ones, you know, and I think that...
Could you explain why?
Well, because my great fear for politics is that, and this is partly our fault as well sometimes, I think, as journalists, we help to strip away the interesting people, or we encourage them to be less interesting. Because when they're interesting, we belabour them for stepping out of line or for embarrassing their party or for breaking a party line. And so we discourage politicians from being interesting. And I think the ones that make it through and are still interesting, even if they are turds, even if they are easy to loathe, I think they're worth having. You know, and of all the public criticism, for instance, that's routinely levelled against dear Tony Abbott, I'm a massive fan of his because I think his brain isn't that far from his mouth, and I like it when that happens. You know, I like it when they don't put so much of a barrier between the brain and mouth, because it just makes life more interesting. It makes decoding them that much simpler. You know, and I think that Malcolm is an interesting, well, he's a very complicated character, but one of the things I like about him as a politician is that in most cases, that is my scarf,
yes,
sorry, that will stop, yeah. In most cases, his instinct is to disclose, you know, and, you know, in the Henson case, for instance, about which, of course, David's written a fabulous book, which you should all buy. He's the one. I mean, I think I'm right. He's the one politician in Australia, isn't he, who was asked about Henson and just said, "Well, I don't see why there should be cops in art galleries," you know, and yes. That was his view. And he was he was criticised by many of his colleagues for being politically foolish and inept for saying it, but that's what he thought, and he said it.
And meanwhile, the leader of his party, Brendan Nelson, was saying that the Henson photographs offend everything that Australia stands for. Everything. and what you reveal, which I'm so furiously jealous about, is the detail of a conversation between these two men at that time in which Malcolm rings Nelson and says,
"Do you know how many art galleries I have in my electorate?"
And that is the value of this book as opposed to mine.
Oh, it's a fabulous little insight, and he's like that. I mean, he kind of goes tearing off and ringing people when he's angry with them, and I mean, on another occasion his relationship with Brendan Nelson, of course, is very strained from day one of Nelson's leadership. I don't think that Turnbull could ever quite believe that Nelson had ever been elected. I mean, he just had difficulty. One of his colleagues said to me, was sort of like the boy who's the captain of the debating team, the captain of the rowing team, the footy, captain, and finally gets pipped at the post for head boy, just couldn't quite comprehend that this could be possible. And, it's been reported before that after Nelson gave a very kind of emotional and humble address to the joint party room after being elected to the leadership, he was resting in his office and dabbing his eyes when Malcolm Turnbull came storming in. There were other people in the room, and just, that was pathetic. That was ridiculous. You sounded like you were delivering a eulogy, and you've got to whip these people up, and and delivered this lecture about how Nelson should have made the address to the troops. And then it was only a few weeks into the leadership, I think, when Turnbull rang Nelson on his mobile phone and said, "Look, this isn't working. I just think you should resign."
He doesn't. He never seems to understand that his advice might be unwelcome.
That is a very key point.
What about the moment when John Howard is driving across the bridge from Kirribilli House in November 2007, having just lost the election, and his phone rings, and it's Malcolm Turnbull, who, look, now there are differing versions of this story. As John Howard remembers it, how did he put it in his description to me? He said, Malcolm rang me and the purpose of the call was to talk about Malcolm. And it was... Howard's recollection is that he rang to announce that he had just retained the seat of Wentworth, with a swing to him, and had some suggestions about what the Prime Minister might say in his concession speech. Anyway, now, Turnbull, it must be said, has a different recollection of this conversation. It says that he rang because he was overcome with the emotion of the moment and wanted to make a gesture towards this poor, enfeebled old man. He didn't say that, I just intuited it from his... Look, this often happens, I find, with situations that involve Turnbull. I mean, his recollection of them often differs from those around him. I mean, this happens in politics a lot. And, when you're writing something that tries to recount a series of events, in politics you've always got to ring 100 people and then kind of, extract what you think sounds the most plausible. I'm sorry. Shall I just de-scarf? Is that? Then that might be. This is not going to be the start of everything, Can we go and do a little amateur psychology about Malcolm? Malcolm?
Why not?
Why not? This is what writing biographies and writing profiles is all about. Two things about Malcolm. First, his mother doesn't run her when he's young. He's, 8 years old? And the second thing is that though the family territory is Double Bay, his father owns the pub. Seems to me that this is a man who has always been hunting for his place, both in families and in territories. The deserted boy whose dad runs the sheaf. Do you reckon he's still that?
I think he's always trying to get somewhere, yeah. And I think that he has a very strong family relationship with his wife Lucy and their two children. They're a very strong family unit, I think. And I think that he's sort of found a bit of a space there. But something that just astounds me and has astounded me over the course of the reading that I did whilst writing this essay is just at every stage of his life he was so stupendously overcommitted. I mean, well, maybe I'm just a naturally lazy person, but he always seems to have so many things going on. I mean, even at university when he was paying a friend of his to attend lectures on his behalf.
It really is true, that's true.
It is true, yeah. $30 a week apparently. To take notes while he was studying law. But at the same time, he was working in the State Parliamentary Press Gallery as a reporter for Channel 9. He was working for 2SM. He was also working for the Nation Review. Then as a law student, he was also writing a weekly column on the law, which is kind of one of the reasons why there's a stage where every senior lawyer in Australia was kind of pissed off with him, I think, because he would hand out this sort of lordly advice to the Chief Justices. I mean, like, there's absolutely no limit to the cheek of the boy, you know. And there was just sort of, I just get this sense that he never really said no to anything. He wanted to do more and more. And yeah, I think to me that's kind of very consistent with the idea of somebody who's sort of trying to find something or find somewhere to belong. I mean, it was always upwards, I suppose.
And looking for patrons all the time.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
And starting with Bob Ellis.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he and Bob were very good friends, and Bob has some slightly indelicate recollections to make in the pages of the essay about. Bob's recollection is that they met after Bob's girlfriend had dumped Bob and then turned up 6 months later on the arm of Malcolm, and despite early consequent hiccups in the Ellis-Turnbull relationship, they became quite good friends, and for quite a few years, I think. Apparently they fell out over another woman, and neither of them will name that woman to me, which makes me suspect that she's very interesting indeed. Like, any fact that you can't get Bob Ellis to disclose is by definition kind of dynamite. It's probably Margaret Thatcher or something. Yeah.
But there is this thing of his career of him finding patrons.
Yeah.
And there was Trevor.
Oh, come on, use that excellent line of yours.
There was Trevor Kennedy at the Bulletin. He was writing the law column for the Bulletin. Then he went on, and then he was.
Neville Wran is a very important one.
Neville
as well.
Wran,
who was a friend of Malcolm Turnbull's mother's at university. So that's how he came into their lives.
Swam into Neville's orbit, and then of course there's Kerry Packer.
Yeah.
And he seems to have fallen out with all of these kind of substitute fathers. He finds them, he kind of seduces them, he's wonderfully good for them for a while, then he betrays them.
Well, I think the exception to that would be Wran, but the great and shining example of that is, of course, Packer, who in many ways was his most important patron in terms of his business interests. I think Turnbull met Packer whilst I think he was, if not a teenager, then in his very early 20s, and he was introduced to Packer by John Singleton. And Packer, I think, spotted immediately just how useful this young man could be for him. And he employed him in a number of guises. He worked for Channel 9 for a little bit. He worked for the Bulletin for a long while, and then eventually in the early 80s, he came on board with Packer as effectively in-house counsel for Nine and Australia Consolidated Press. And that was a particularly important time in Turnbull's life, because he started work as an in-house lawyer for Packer really only a matter of months after his own father died. Bruce Turnbull, who was the only sort of remaining family member that Malcolm had a reasonably close hand. And I think that, again, without wanting to lapse too much into pop psychology, I think that he was grieving for his father when he was thrown into an extremely busy and emotionally fraught time with Packer, which was the Goanna allegations and the Costigan Royal Commission. And here, I think, is where Turnbull cemented his usefulness to Packer, because, of course, the situation was that there was this sort of long-running Costigan Royal Commission into the painters and dockers, wasn't it?
Starting to painters and dockers,
yeah. And then and there were mentions in evidence of this shadowy businessman. Some of this evidence was published in the National Times. Yeah. So we had this situation where Packer was sort of being talked about but hadn't been identified. He was codenamed Goanna. And they had a meeting all together with Packer and various counsel. Tom Hughes, I think, was there, and Malcolm Turnbull, tried to work out how they were going to deal with this situation on Packer's behalf. And Turnbull's the one that came up with this incredibly sort of outrageous scheme, which was that that Packer would out himself as the goanna and go on the attack against Costigan and against the QC, Marr, who was involved in the Royal Commission, and publish, in effect, this sort of 5,000 to 8,000 word paper which would identify Packer. And it was a very front foot, very kind of aggressive tactic that Packer liked immediately. Hardly anyone else in the room endorsed it, but Turnbull suggested it, Packer took it up, and away they went. And it meant that Turnbull, very unusually for a lawyer at the time, was doing an enormous amount of TV, media. He was kind of a bouncer for Packer in the public eye. He was more aggressive,
Smooth,
even...
bright bouncer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But brave as well.
Oh, certainly. And I think that this... I think that Turnbull is a brilliant advocate in many ways, not only because he's articulate and clever, but because he's utterly fearless, and he has no reservations about estranging people in the course of his business. Once you've got him as a client, he'll practically tear anyone apart for you. I mean, I think that's the lesson from his work as a legal counsel. And look, I think that put noses out of joint in the legal community as well. It was very unusual at the time for a lawyer to be doing all this media work. Turnbull explained it at the time by saying, well, look, Kerry's not a lawyer, these are legal issues, better to have me doing the talking. And he was every bit as aggressive as Packer would have been, so it suited Packer. So, look, I think that whole period, to return to our original line of discussion, really cemented the relationship between those two men into something much, much more than just an employment relationship, much more than, a mogul that's found a bright young thing. I mean, I think there was something very emotional about that.
Though in the end, and it goes surely to Turnbull's credit, he broke with him.
Yes, in the most sensational
broke with him. And had it out. But in the course of those dealings, I mean, Turnbull as a lawyer, Turnbull as a head kicker, Turnbull as a sort of a Rottweiler for hire, was unafraid to make enemies, unafraid to trim the rules, blind to sort of this kind of civilised codes of conduct around the town.
Absolutely.
Didn't mind being loathed, all of those things. But they're not actually terribly good qualities in politics.
Yeah, it's a hell of a transition. And I think that, watching Turnbull deal with leadership, I think, is interesting. I think, his enthusiasm is boundless. His determination is limitless. He is prepared to take anyone on. But see, politics is just so different from just about anything else. And I think Turnbull has always viewed life as a meritocracy, and life has kind of performed that way for him to date. I mean, if you're smart and aggressive and persistent, then pretty much things...
You'll get $175 million and you'll be the leader of the opposition.
Still a disputed figure, isn't it?
Though, as you point out in the essay, after the first 50 million, it becomes, slightly irrelevant.
Something that Kevin Rudd's struggling with as well, I think.
But now he has to deal with people. Now he has to win people over. And it struck me at the time of the referendum on the monarchy, on the republic, that he was articulate, that he was never done, that he was fearless in the way he put his arguments. But somehow there is something about him which is not winning.
Yes, well, I mean, all you have to do is to look at the polls, and that'll give you a pretty crisp answer about that at the moment. Look, I think that politics... Malcolm has two constituencies to deal with here. First of all, there's the constituency of his own party room, and look, I mean, it might be a sort of fatuous-sounding observation, but it's very critical for somebody in Malcolm Turnbull's position. He's in a position where some of his colleagues still view him with suspicion. He won the leadership ballot sort of fairly narrowly, and he's always got this sort of wraith-like figure of Peter Costello wandering around. And it's actually a sort of a threat, the kind of threat for which Malcolm Turnbull's life has not prepared him, I think, because, because Costello isn't really doing anything, he's just sort of...
And for Malcolm, it's all about having a stoush with
A fight,
somebody.
yeah.
And there's Costello just wandering around.
Your fist goes straight through him. I mean, there's nothing there at the moment. He's just, well, I'm just reading this magazine. What are you talking about, you crazy man? I'm not doing anything. So Costello, and he isn't really, apart from just sort of hanging around and being significant by virtue of his own presence, his continued presence. Now, I would imagine this is sort of uniquely frustrating for somebody like Turnbull, who, if he sees a threat, likes to eliminate it, either, sue it, buy it, or smash it, And he's good at that, and not worried about doing that either. He's not squeamish about any of these sort of conflicts, not at all. He thrives on conflict. And, whereas, Costello, I think, avoids it on the whole. So you've got this sort of funny kind of situation where someone's looking for a fight and someone isn't, I think I'm getting off the topic I know now, but there's a fantastic imbalance in that relationship anyway with Turnbull and Costello. I mean, they can't stand each other and all that. But Turnbull is so impatient, and, I guess a wise political counsel might have, been for him to wait around for a few years, wait until the opposition entered a slightly more winnable stage of the opposition cycle. I mean, political orthodoxy says that for the first 1 to 5 terms of opposition, you fight like minks and just sort of rip each other to shreds, and then eventually, the one person left standing will become Kevin Rudd, and, obviously that's accidental.
But Malcolm can't wait.
But no, he can't. He's completely under-endowed with political patience. And, whereas on the other side, Peter Costello often thinks he's wildly over-endowed with it. He's just waiting for everything to be completely perfect, Dear me.
And then he might make his move.
Well, he might, yeah.
Yes, he might.
If asked nicely, yeah. But
now tell me about writing of this. How did Malcolm react when you said that you were going to do this, and how much access did he give you?
Well, he reacted well. I went and asked him about it before I agreed to do it, because I thought it probably wouldn't be much use if I didn't have any access to him. And I get along fine with Malcolm, and I wasn't particularly chummy with him, and I was overseas when he entered Parliament, so I'd sort of got to know him a little bit. And he said, he was extremely decent about the whole thing. He said, yes, sure, you can have some access. I don't have any. He said, I don't think that you have an agenda, so I'm happy to cooperate. So we had.
How does he define agenda?
Well, I think politicians are always worried about people doing lengthy attack jobs on them, and I think he thought that I wasn't out to
that.
Yeah. And as it happens, I wasn't, so that was lucky. So we had lots of conversations that were sort of background conversations. I spent a bit of time with him and
driving around
with
in
his
cars
wife.
quite a lot.
Yes, well, I said, well, look, we can have off-the-record conversations, that's fine. I'd like to have an on-the-record interview at some point, at some length, and he said that's fine too, and he was as good as his word, so that's how it sort of unfolded. And then the rest of the time, I talked to a great many of his colleagues, not many of whom are quoted. I just wanted to get a sense of how he was viewed across the party. I talked to some other people who weren't in politics about him as well. But look, I think with someone like Turnbull, you can't you can't talk to everyone who might have an opinion on him, because he's met billions of people, pissed off half of them, and and in a piece of this length, you can't really canvass everything. So I was sort of just trying to present a bit of a flavour of him, I suppose.
And you went to see John Howard.
I did go to see John Howard.
Tell us about his office.
Look, it's a fabulous, fabulous office. And look, John Howard is much funnier, I think, than often comes across. It was really interesting to see him, actually, because I hadn't seen him at any length since the night of the phone call on the bridge and the terrible misadventure with the Cedar Burnalong, and that's right, the entire country. I have only ever covered politics with John Howard as Prime Minister. I started in the Parliamentary Press Gallery in 1999, and so he was the only Prime Minister I'd ever reported directly on. So, I'd never seen, a real-life, fresh ex-Prime Minister before, so I was kind of interested to see whether he'd be kind of, weeping into his Bonox or anything, but he was. He's got this fabulous office. It's on the 52nd or 3rd floor of the MLC building, sort of sparkling view. It's extraordinary, and it's like you know, in the castle when they say, you know, that's going straight to the pool room. Well, the whole office is like that. And it was when I visited, it was still being set up, and there was, I mean, just hundreds of framed sort of, you know, grip and grin photographs and framed...
Grip and grin.
Yeah, you know, those sort of two-up kind of Prime Minister meets, you know, I was about to say Dalai Lama, but that doesn't happen. So, Pope, you know, everybody, and a couple of sort of framed baggy greens and all that sort of stuff that, you know, the detritus of you know, more than a decade's successful prime ministering, you know, in souvenirs and mementos. I mean, there are enough of them stacked up on chairs to cover many more walls than were in the place. But the best thing was when you get into the private office, which does have a fabulous view. The status of all the people in the photographs tracks up immediately. So, you know, it's all, you have to be a pope or a president or a, you know, a monarch of, you know, quite a significant country to be in the private sanctum framed with John Howard. But look, on the whole, I found him excellent company. Was he's completely walked away from the whole thing, really. I mean, he's interested in politics. I don't think that John Howard would ever be not interested in politics, but there's no real sense of regret there or bitterness or really even wondering that much about it all. I mean, I think he is not in the business and has never really been in the business of keeping himself up at night with replaying things that he might have done, and I found that absolutely to be true of him in his sort of post-government
but this also gets
stage.